I became an editor of Wikipedia. Somebody had started an entry and I looked at it and thought, this is all wrong. So I started rewriting it. But then I entered into this ridiculous battle with Wikipedia editors. Anyone that's ever done this will know. There's this kind of mysterious world of like Wikipedia Illuminati. The moment you start changing anything, they pop up and start telling you off. I knew what was true, but Wikipedia has this weird rule where you can't put anything on there unless it's listed somewhere else on the internet. Well, of course, none of this was, because, none of this was known. I changed it to the factual truth, and they changed it back saying, you can't put that in, it's nowhere else on the internet. So, in the end, I thought, I'm sick of this. I need my own website.
You're listening to The Corruption Diaries Season 2. All about the music exec turned tax justice campaigner Richard Allen, in his own words. I'm Naomi Fowler. In this episode, Richard builds a community and rallies people to take action. It's not easy creating change, but by 2009 Richard was ready for a big leap forward in his fight to make the landscape fairer for businesses like his now defunct record label and mail order company. And it all began with the Wikipedia Illuminati.
I was publicising what I was doing by updating an entry on Wikipedia about low-value consignment relief.
That's LVCR, the tax loophole that companies had been exploiting to dodge VAT or VAT, a kind of sales tax. LVCR was responsible for companies undercutting the products Richard was selling by taking advantage of a tax loophole that involved sending their items to the Channel Islands and back again. That gave them such an edge, Richard couldn't compete with them and he was forced to close his company down.
I came across a guy on a forum moaning about low-value consignment relief in relation to ink cartridges. Chris Holgate runs a company called Refresh Cartridges. We got talking on this forum and then we rang each other and he said, look, I'm in a different area to you. I'm getting hammered on ink cartridges. We decided that we would form a group together and he would set up the website and we had to come up with a name. It was late one night in the shed and a friend of mine, Mark Beard, we were having a joke. I was thinking, I've got to come up with a name for this group. I said, RAVAS would be good. Can we get to that? The ravers, raving on about... closest we could get was RAVAS, Retailers Against VAT Abuse Schemes, but it was an attempt to get to ravers, although Mark always said you've got to say it with a Spanish accent, RAVAS. The website and the blog that were attached with it started getting more and more traffic, not just music industry supporters, but people from all sorts of areas. And soon we had evidence coming in from horticulturalists who were being hammered by it, health foods who were being hammered by it, and it started to snowball. During RAVAS, I realised that it wasn't just me. Once I started RAVAS, other people came to me with their horror stories, and I suddenly realised that these people were depending on me to win this battle. So I went from a sort of selfish interest to realising that I was actually waving a flag for a lot of people. I actually felt that I was helping other people.
In 2010, there was an inconclusive general election in the UK and two parties formed a coalition government with a new finance minister or chancellor called George Osborne. And thanks to the help of Martin Smith, the guy who worked for the Forum of Private Business and been their representative in Brussels, Richard was able to get in contact with the Conservative Party's Treasury team before they came to power.
So we had been briefing George Osborne and his team before they took government, the coalition government. So by the time they came into power, they had an understanding of what was going on. And to his credit, George Osborne immediately requested a review in 2010 of Channel Island low-value consignment relief.
While this review was going on, other pieces were starting to align. In the last episode, Richard had rekindled a complaint at the European Commission, the European Union's main executive body, and that effort was finally paying off.
The European Commission was starting to engage. June 2010, I was told by the Commission they were going to pursue infraction proceedings against the UK and had made the threat because they felt there was sufficient evidence to take it to the European Court. Infraction proceedings is where the European Commission takes member states to the European Court for implementing European law incorrectly, and it's how they force them to correct it. That was a massive step. I had managed to get the Commission to threaten the UK with legal action.
The British Tax Authority, HMRC, was now forced to engage with the European Commission. 2 years earlier, the UK had responded to the Commission's accusations by saying, "You describe a practice of circular rerouting of goods from the UK and back again that you consider abusive, but do not supply any factual evidence of an actual case. The UK considers that it is for the administrations of member states to determine whether evidence of avoidance, evasion or abuse has occurred. Accordingly, my authorities do not accept the assertion that the conditions for a finding of abuse are necessarily fulfilled in relation to the situation you complain about."
In the correspondence between the Commission and the UK, the Commission is saying you can remove mail order goods to prevent the abuse. The UK's position initially was, we don't accept your interpretation of the legislation. HMRC were trying to argue, we can't stop it. Now that really annoyed me at the time because I'm thinking, whose side are you on?
4 years, Richard, along with industry representatives like Steve Kersley, had met repeatedly with UK government officials and had tried to explain why the European Commission's position was correct. But their efforts led nowhere. According to Richard, a senior civil servant he'd actually met and provided evidence to was signing letters to the Commission saying the trade was under control and that nobody was using the Channel Islands to round-trip products into the UK to dodge tax. But Richard and music distributor Steve Kersley tracked a package from his warehouse out to Guernsey and back again to the UK the following day and shared that evidence with the Commission. Armed with Steve and Richard's industry intel, the Commission threatened the UK with infraction proceedings. Those are the steps they can take when a member state doesn't comply with EU law. The whole process can result in fines. Richard finally saw his opportunity to get something done about LVCR. He actually got through to one of the top people at HMRC, the Director of Excise, Customs, Stamps and Money.
Which, even now, I can't believe I did it. It's impossible to do that. I got to his PA and I said, "Could I speak to Mike Norgrove, please?" She said, "What's it about?" And I said, "Well, it's about infraction proceedings, European Commission." She said, "Well, could you put it in writing?" I said, "No, I want to speak to him now. And if he doesn't speak to me now, my next call is going to be to the national press." He immediately came on and I said, "I am the person behind the complaint at the European Commission. If you don't fix this, I am going to assist the Commission in their prosecution of the UK and I will give them all the evidence they need to win." And I said, "And they will win." He called me back the following week and said, "I've met with my team and there is a problem."
For Richard, this was a real turning point. He finally felt like he had some leverage. But as the momentum picked up in autumn 2010, it all went a bit cloak and dagger.
I insisted that we had a meeting and they granted that meeting, and I had to appear carrying my passport and waiting for people who would identify themselves at a particular location in London. I remember telling my wife about this and she was quite worried and she said, "What happens if they bump you off?" I met two guys in the street in London, in Holborn actually. One of them was a guy that was responsible for the policy. The other guy was an HMRC customs investigator, the sort of guy that would deal with smuggling, that kind of thing. They took me to an unmarked building. It looked like a disused office building, but when you went up, it was a hive of activity. As soon as I walked into the room, somebody shouted out, "There's a stranger in the building," or something like that. We went into a little room and I was sat down and I spent 2 days there going through everything. They'd done some work on it, but they really had no understanding of how the trade was operating. I took someone with me. on the second day, I think it was, and it was Steve Kersley from Proper Distribution. He went along, and of course, he's supplying all of these people in the Channel Islands.
As a distributor, Steve Kersley was selling CDs that were being bought up by retailers who were undercutting the retail prices by avoiding VAT, the sales tax, by sending it to customers via the islands of Guernsey and Jersey.
So he told them how the transactions worked, who was paid, where the goods went, who ordered it, how it was shipped, blah-de-blah-de-blah. I had a document that I had obtained from the Jersey government, and it was a discussion in the Jersey Parliament about the exemption, and I said that it demonstrated that Jersey knew that they were doing something that was dodgy, but they were attempting to basically make it look better than it was.
One document was an official States of Jersey letter written in 2006 by a law officer. It says, "The Minister is concerned that Jersey is being used as part of a selling structure which is a complete sham, and that goods travel to and from the island for the sole purpose of being a token sale."
They asked me, "Where did you get this document?" I felt I was being questioned by the police at that point. And they said, "Did you steal it?" And I went, "No, I didn't." I said, "I got it from a website." And they said, "What website?" I said, "The Jersey government website. It's available on their website." And they said, "Well, could you tell us where it is?" I just thought, I'm one person in a shed. This is the tax authority with teams of people supposedly in charge of what's going on, and they're asking me. I just couldn't believe it. After that, there was silence.
For Richard, that may have been true, but suddenly he found out he'd helped move a mountain.
January 2011, I got a phone call in the shed from Patrice Pia, European Commission. He said, "We just had an email from the UK government. Unlike anything we've seen before, it looks like they're going to close it down." And I went, "That's amazing."
But it was unclear what "close it down" actually meant. A few months later, the European Commission contacted Richard to let him know that the UK seemed intent on stopping the problems caused by LVCR. They said there'd been a marked shift in attitude. Not long after that, Richard was sitting in his shed when he got an email from a business that had been complaining to HMRC about the tax loophole. They said they'd discovered that British officials were giving the UK minister the option to simply remove Channel Island mail-order goods from LVCR, thereby closing the loophole.
This was going to be put to the minister, who was David Gork, who was Financial Secretary to the Treasury.
This was Richard's biggest indication to date of a genuine shift in attitude. He later found out that Gork's predecessor had been wrongly advised by Treasury officials and HMRC that the problem was with EU law itself and not something that the UK could fix. His predecessor wrote afterwards that, "I was therefore astonished that a very straightforward application of existing EU legislation was eventually identified to solve the problem." It's often said by senior officials that sometimes they have to take the criticism for wrong decisions made by politicians. Where does the responsibility here lie? With the minister at the time or with their government advisors? We don't know.
So eventually David Gork got given that option. On November 9th, 2011, I was sitting in my shed. It was a hot sunny day. And my friend Mark, he had a motorbike, parked it up at the front, came to the shed. And I said, "Hang on a minute, I've got to deal with this. Something's come up." So he sat down on the sofa behind me. The budget's on my computer monitor. And then George Osborne says this.
"And we're going to tackle the exploitation of low-value consignment relief that has left our high street music stores fighting a losing battle with warehouses in the Channel Islands."
George Osborne was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, the UK's finance minister.
George Osborne announced that they were going to remove low-value consignment relief from the Channel Islands, and he gave a speech in the Houses of Parliament where he talks about record shops. My phone rings and it's Steve Kersley.
That's the music distributor who'd been supporting Richard's campaign.
And he said, "Did you hear that? That's incredible." The next phone call was The Guardian, and they said, "Have you got a statement?" And I wasn't even prepared for it. And I turned around to Mark and I said, "I've got to write a statement. It's The Guardian to respond to what the Chancellor just said." And Mark, who's watched this throughout and in amazement, you can imagine from the outside it all looked a bit surreal. I'm in my shed saying, I've just spoken to George Osborne. He's going, what? My phone didn't stop ringing all day. I was then whisked off to the BBC, and I was on the news there talking about it, and everybody was congratulating me. I had bottles of wine turning up for days from businesses that were thankful. There was a horticulturalist in the Vale of Evesham who sent me a whole crate of champagne, who had been hammered by the flower scam for decades, and I'd ended it. That was a real high. That felt like victory. I was having, you should get an OBE, a Rise Sir Richard, all these ridiculous emails were coming in because businesses were over the moon. And my MP told me that someone stopped her at a business lunch and said, that's the best thing your government's ever done. And she said, well, it wasn't our government, it was a constituent of mine. 2 days later, I suddenly thought, and what have I got out of this? Nothing. It had no impact on me at all, other than the satisfaction of knowing that I'd done it. We were living a very frugal life. It was a very difficult period. We were skint. I wrote a long letter to Mike Norgrove.
He was the Director of Excise, Customs, Stamps and Money at HMRC.
And said, I helped you, I've done good. I literally saved the country hundreds of millions of pounds a year through my own personal efforts. I have spent years on this. I have been instrumental in closing this down. I lost my business. I've spent hours and hours assisting HMRC dealing with this. 2 days in London. I got £25 rail ticket for those 2 days, nothing else. All I wanted was a meeting for them to sit down with me and go, thanks for your help, just to acknowledge what I'd done. But I got this terse reply, dear Mr. Allen, we refute everything you say and we will defend ourselves in court.
You've been listening to The Corruption Diaries with me, Naomi Fowler, and produced by Leo Schick. Sound design also by Leo Schick. Delirium Records music used in this episode was courtesy of Cherry Red. If you liked a song, see the track listing in the episode notes.